This series is supported by the Knight Foundation. It's part of the transatlantic initiative titled Digital Governance for Democratic Renewal, organized by Columbia World Projects at Columbia University, and the Center for Digital Governance at the Hertie School. And through this partnership, we develop working groups, we publish reports, we hold public meetings for broad audiences. We will be developing briefings for policymakers over the next 12 months. And of course, we run this speaker series. I represent Columbia World Projects, an initiative of Columbia University that connects policymakers, practitioners, and researchers to explore pressing issues, including what sustains and ails liberal democracy around the world, while offering focused solutions for revitalizing democracy and proposing precise pathways to implementation. And the work we're going to hear about today is very much in that spirit. And we're joined in this partnership by the Center for Digital Governance at the Hertie School, represented by Danny Stockman, and which serves as a gateway to the governance of digital transformation and supports synergies between rigorous academic research, world-leading education, and socially relevant policy insights on the challenges and opportunities of the digital era. Danny, why don't you take it from here?
Sure, thank you, Tom. So I have the pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. I'm extremely happy to have Anu Bradford with us, who is a leading scholar on the EU's regulatory power and a sought-after commentator on the European Union, global economy, and digital regulation. She coined the term the Brussels effect to describe the European Union's outsized influence on global markets. She's also the author of the Brussels effects, and she's also the author of a more recent book, which is called Digital Empires, The Global Battle to Regulate Technology, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2023. This last book was recognized as one of the best books of 2023 by Financial Times and awarded the 2024 Stein-Rockan Prize for Comparative Social Science Research. Her earlier book received the best book of 2020 by Foreign Affairs. And we have the pleasure to have a discussant with us, Max von Thun, who is the Director of Europe and Transatlantic Partnerships at the Open Markets Institute. He leads open markets research and advocacy in Europe alongside efforts to bring about greater alignment in transatlantic competition policy and enforcement. Von Thun's work touches on a range of antitrust and competition issues in Europe, with a particular focus on technology and new legislative frameworks targeting big tech companies' market power and platform power. Prior to joining Open Markets, von Thun advised UK parliamentarians on economic policy, led the research program at think tank, the Centre for Entrepreneurs, and also worked as a consultant on EU and UK technology and competition policy. So without further ado, Anu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Danny, for that kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and really delighted to share this conversation. So let me maybe start with what we all now are watching to unfold from Washington and what that means for Europe as a framing. So there is an increasing alliance between Silicon Valley and Washington, and the tech companies have discovered that the best path to resist the European regulatory agenda that they have observed as one of the most constraining forces for them is to team up with the Trump administration and leverage that administration then to potentially politicize the enforcement battles with the Europeans and thereby rein in the regulatory impulses of the Europeans. So I think we all are quite familiar with the set of regulations that have now been passed in Brussels over the last few years, with the goal of enhancing digital rights and democracy in particular. So we talk about competition, so antitrust, privacy, and content moderation, and the latest one, the artificial intelligence. And now I think the big question is whether and how this agenda can be implemented in the midst of today's geopolitical pressure. So in many ways, I see two threats to this European rights-driven digital regulatory agenda. One is the external one. So the fear that the US tech companies are increasingly reluctant to comply and are prepared to push back on European regulations. So we'll see threats, we see attempts to to bargain with the government and escalate the tensions that way. But there's also the second threat that is now more internal. So the Europeans are no longer as confident about their place in the world and their place in the digital world. So what the Europeans are very focused on now is their strategic autonomy in today's geopolitical world, where they feel they can no longer trust their allies like the United States, and the need to then shed dependencies of the US. So one big question now in Brussels, and I think Max can speak more to this, what the tone is, that the Europeans feel that maybe we can no longer afford to focus on digital rights and democracy. We need to focus on innovation. We need to focus on growing these tech companies so that we are more independent and able to defend our values, our interests in the world that no longer conforms to the kind of values as easily as we thought. So let me just show you one picture that I think motivates now this conversation to some extent. So the Europeans are very worried about this. They are regulating technologies, but they are not generating these technologies. So this describes the top 20 tech companies in the world based on their market cap, and the blue bubbles are the US tech companies that are clearly dominating the scene. So we talk about the top 5, Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, Nvidia, Amazon together have over 15 trillion in market cap. You see 2 European companies in that top 20. You see the Dutch ASML from the semiconductor sector and the German SAP. But they are tiny compared to the dominance of the US tech companies. So this obviously now raises the question, what explains the Europeans' inability to generate these technology giants? And I am worried in many ways by the development of the European tech sector. I think the Europeans do need to ask that question, but I am equally worried of the very, I would say, blunt narrative that lacks the nuance of the analysis that equates the European propensity to regulate in this space with its inability to innovate. So my goal now today in our conversation is try to offer you an alternative explanation for the difference in US-EU tech innovations that have very little to do with digital regulations. So another way to think about the conversation is that it is a defense for the European digital regulatory agenda, giving them the continuing confidence to continue to enforce those laws, to enhance rights and protect democracy, while at the same time drawing the European attention to a set of policy reforms that are needed for the Europeans to be able to enhance their digital sovereignty and build a vibrant tech sector. It is also then, in my view, an attempt to send a message to any other regulator around the world, including the United States, to say that, look, if you are also pursuing digital rights, protecting privacy, trying to eradicate harmful content from the online platforms, and make sure that AI is developed in the way that protects democracy and the rights. It doesn't mean that those regulations come at the cost of innovation. So we need to think about the bigger picture of what drives technological innovation. So let me now try to offer you what I see as the main reasons why the Europeans are not able to innovate at the level of the Americans. So the first reason is that there is no digital single market in Europe. The market remains fragmented. There are linguistic differences, there are cultural differences, and there are legal differences, which makes it very hard for tech companies to scale across the common market. So obviously it was much easier for Amazon to start as an e-commerce company to sell books across the US when there was a uniform demand for English-speaking books. That is not the case in Europe. The same way, if you think about the Netflixes of the world, it is much easier to disseminate those movies across the US, where people in Michigan and Virginia largely watch similar movies. That doesn't happen in Portugal and Latvia the same way. So this has nothing to do with the GDPR or the DMA or the DSA or the AI Act. It is that there are fundamental differences that explain the fragmentation of the European marketplace. There's very little the Europeans can do to remove the linguistic barriers, but there are also legal barriers that continue to exist. So if we think about rather the European regulatory agenda, and if anybody is upset about the stringency of the regulations like the DSA, an alternative to DSA is not no DSA. The alternative is 27 different regulatory regimes that further fragments the European market and makes it harder for companies to scale. So that's the first reason that I want to call your attention to. So the American companies have benefited from a rather uniform market within which they've been able to scale, and that hasn't been available for the Europeans. The second, the availability of capital. The American companies have benefited from a vibrant venture capital market that has fueled their growth to the size that they have today. We have no integrated capital markets union in Europe. European tech companies are mainly raising money from banks, so as opposed to venture capital industry. So if you think about the global venture capital industry, about 5% of that capital is in Europe, 52% in the US, over 40% in China. So the Americans have benefited tremendously from the vibrant capital markets in the country. The European companies, the tech companies, are able to raise money in the first few funding rounds, but as soon as they need more money, they need to either turn to American venture capital or they are acquired by the US tech giants. So again, nothing to do with the European digital regulations, much to do with the capital, its availability in the US and lack of availability in Europe. One may say, though, that, look, capital is global, so why can't the Europeans grow with the help of US venture capital? And yes, to some extent they do that. But the US venture capital funds, they want to fund more local companies because they're very active in the management. They need to know the risks that they are dealing with, and they can work with them in Silicon Valley where they can say that, okay, oh, you need a new CTO. I know I did a deal with this and this company. I'm going to bring this person in. Oh, you need more strategy. I went to Stanford with this and this. Let me bring this person to come and help your company. It's much harder to do that for Berlin, for Lisbon, for Helsinki. Okay, so capital. The third reason that explains the differences is the legal barriers and cultural attitudes towards risk-taking. Americans are in a much better position to pursue disruptive, risky innovations that are absolutely crucial in this space. Because if they fail, they are not done for good. In Europe, you have some of the most stringent bankruptcy laws that don't give entrepreneurs a second chance. You fail and you are done. Whereas in the US, you start your company, you sometimes fail, then you start a new one and you go and raise money for that new company. And guess what? They give you more money because it seems like you're working on big things. In Europe, there's a stigma around failure, and it is personal tragedy that is very hard to recover from. And that holds the European entrepreneurs back. The fourth reason, and this I find extremely important, and that is the Americans' ability to tap into global talent. So Americans are a magnet for entrepreneurs from around the world, for AI scientists, those who come often to leading US universities as a gateway also to the American labor market. So American innovations benefit from this global diverse innovation space. If you look at over $1 billion companies in the US, over 50% of those have an immigrant founder. If we focus for a moment just on those big tech companies whose huge bubbles I showed you and they founders, Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, second generation Cuban. Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, South African. Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, Brazilian. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, Russian. This is again not the story that the Europeans have been regulating for digital rights. This is the story that the Europeans haven't replicated, the great asset of the United States, which is to attract the global talent to the US. So this again has a very important explanatory factor. And here, I can mention also, and what I've been saying to the Europeans, that if this new administration is going to follow its very hostile stand towards immigration and keep that talent out of the US, that is an opportunity for the Europeans to roll the red carpet and welcome that talent to Europe. So those are some of the issues that I wanted to highlight, and I highlight those in the recent paper that I published, the false choice between digital regulation and innovation. There are obviously other issues. I would highlight the labor markets, the non-compete clauses that are very prevalent in Europe, not prevalent in Silicon Valley, makes it's much easier to move the talent around. So there are the sort of host of other issues, but those are the four that I thought it might be interesting for us to discuss and recognize, and in a way to take the pressure away from the Europeans to say that, look, scaling back our commitment to digital regulation is our path to competitiveness. No, the European path to competitiveness is that they need to continue to build the kind of digital regulations and enforce them that are consistent with the European values, but at the same time make sure that they build those other pillars of a thriving tech ecosystem that will give the Europeans the kind of digital sovereignty that they so desperately need in today's world. So with that, maybe I thank you and hand it over to Danny or to Max.
Max, would you like to continue with your questions and your comments?
Yeah, sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Anu, for that fantastic presentation, and also for the fantastic paper, which is the foundation of that presentation. I mean, I completely agree with you on this kind of issue of this false dichotomy between regulation and innovation, and I think your work is a really kind of useful counterpoint to that, you know, based on hard evidence. From what I've seen in Brussels and in the UK and in the kind of places where my work is focused, you know, that kind of regulation versus innovation narrative has been very powerful. And I'd say particularly recently, since we've seen, you know, the kind of rise of generative AI and countries and governments competing to try and seize the benefits of that. I think industry has been very effective in kind of using, again, the simplistic narrative to basically push back on regulation, you know, in their own self-interest. And I think a very good example of how this kind of way of thinking is having concrete events is in the UK, where yesterday the government in the UK basically fired the head of the UK's competition authority because he apparently wasn't being pro-growth enough. So I think, yeah, I think we need to be kind of pushing back on that narrative. And you know, I think if you look at kind of Europe's history, you know, when today's dominant tech companies were being founded, when they were scaling up, I mean, Europe didn't really have any digital regulation to speak to. So I think that is obviously very strong evidence for why that's not really the issue and the kind of cause of that slide you were showing earlier. And I completely agree that we need to look at, you know, other much more significant factors like the fragmented digital single market, you know, the lack of a real common European capital market and so on. I think another point that for me is very important is I think we need to have a much more sophisticated conversation around innovation and what we mean when we're talking about it. I think at the moment, the word is kind of used without much critique. It's kind of just used as a way to win arguments. You know, we need innovation, and therefore you shouldn't regulate, or you shouldn't do whatever. And I think actually, you know, we need to distinguish, for example, between and I'm drawing on the work of Ariel Ezrachi, who's written a lot about this. You know, between, for example, sustaining and disruptive innovation. You know, sustaining innovation being basically innovation rolled out by incumbents in a market that's basically designed to strengthen their market power rather than to really shake things up. And actually, I think a lot of what we're seeing in AI right now, even though it's presented as disruption, is actually really about reinforcing existing market power. So think of how Google is, for example, integrating AI into its search engine, or Meta doing the same with social media. And I think we also need to distinguish between toxic and beneficial innovation. So again, you know, there's a big difference between new technologies that make it easier to surveil us, to manipulate our behavior online, versus technologies that allow us to live healthier, more productive, sustainable lives, for example. And again, I think in the current AI debate, there really this kind of nuance is not there. And I think if you kind of try and question the current trajectory of the technology or the paradigm, kind of dominant paradigm right now, you're just kind of critiqued as being anti-innovation. So I think that's too simplistic. I think it's also important to look at innovation is just one thing we want to pursue societally, but it's not doesn't necessarily always come first. There are lots of other societal objectives we care about, from resilience to sustainability, national security, democracy, and I don't think innovation will always come first, in comparison to those things. And I think, ultimately we need to ask ourselves, is this particular innovation going to benefit the public interest? And I think if our conclusion is no, either we use regulation to try and steer it in a more beneficial direction, or if we don't think that's possible, then I think sometimes we might say, we don't actually want this technology on our market, whether it's the European market or elsewhere. And I think a good example of this in practice is, Apple recently launched Apple Intelligence, which is basically their way of adding generative AI to the iPhone. And they didn't launch it in Europe initially, but they said it was because of EU regulation. I mean, whether that's true or not, that's what happened. And a lot of people at the time said, oh, this is a disaster. Europe is going to miss out on all this AI innovation. Its tech sector is going to fall further behind. And yet, just last week, Apple said they were actually pulling the product because it was promoting all kinds of misinformation, on people's iPhones, including about BBC headlines and so on. So I think, that's a good example of actually the risks of just kind of saying, all innovation is good. We'll just put it on the market and see what happens afterwards. I think one other, point that I would want to make is actually, I agree that regulation is not the reason why Europe hasn't built a competitive tech sector, but I'd actually go further potentially and say that actually, under enforcement of EU digital regulation and competition law has actually been more of the problem than over regulation. If you look at the EU's competition enforcement, for example, I mean, yes, there's been a lot of headlines about investigations into Google and other companies, but if you look at the actual results and the types of remedies that have been used by the Commission, actually, the results have been quite underwhelming. In the Google cases, for example, very limited behavioral remedies were imposed, and fines that were really kind of absorbed by Google. We've seen very, very few mergers blocked in the tech space as well, at least until recently. And so the big tech companies were able to really strengthen their power in Europe and around the world through those acquisitions. So I think certainly that's an area where actually we should be doing more. We have the DMA now, and again, we have a kind of what seems to be a tougher enforcement posture. So hopefully that leads to results, but we'll have to see. And then I think also what we've seen with the tech rules, and I think I'm particularly thinking of the GDPR here, is actually they've potentially been enforced in a way that has, unintentionally actually kind of benefited the incumbents in a way and created more barriers for smaller businesses. So if you think of the way the GDPR is designed, it kind of applies to everyone in the market more or less in the same way, and that's created a lot of bureaucracy for smaller businesses, whereas it's been quite easily absorbed by the big tech companies, and so that's actually potentially worsening the problem and the dependence on American tech companies. I think there is a recognition that has been a problem, and so with the DMA and the DSA and even the AI Act to an extent now, there's the obligations are more concentrated on the bigger players, whether they're called gatekeepers or VLOPs, but I think that's quite a recent development. And so I think if my thesis is right about kind of it being more a problem under enforcement than over enforcement, then I would argue, the last thing we should be doing right now is backing down on tech enforcement because of the return of Trump, which I think some of us are concerned that may be what happens. That will only kind of entrench the market power of the existing incumbents even further, which will make it harder for European alternatives to emerge in AI and in tech more generally. And it will also deepen Europe's dependencies on the US big tech companies, which I would argue, given what seems to be a growing alliance between the Trump administration and those companies, is now not just an economic problem for Europe, but it's really a geopolitical threat to Europe. And we've obviously seen Elon Musk, most obviously, but Zuckerberg being kind of increasingly aggressive in their willingness to interfere in European democracy and kind of European political processes. So those are kind of my main points. I think in terms of a question for Anu, I would be interested to get your thoughts on how you think the EU is going to respond to the return of Trump and the kind of new dynamics that, as I said, the relationship between the companies and the government. I think there's kind of two schools of thought here. One, which I just endorsed, is that actually this makes the case for strong digital enforcement even more important and even more urgent. But I think there are others, and there's been some media reports suggesting this, that the Commission is actually planning to weaken some of its enforcement as a means of trying to kind of extend an olive branch to Trump, and hoping that maybe if they trade off some antitrust or digital regulation, maybe Trump will impose lower tariffs for Europe on something like that. So I'm curious to see where you see that dynamic going. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Max. And Anu, would you like to respond to the last question that was raised or any of the other points?
Yeah, so I think it's a key question that Europeans are asking themselves and what all of us are observing. And so there's what I think the Europeans should do and what I think they will do. So what they should do is, I completely agree with you, they need to stand firm behind the agenda. And I'm actually quite optimistic that they will. Because what's the alternative? If you start politicizing the digital agenda, there's no end to it. You set the dynamic for the 4 years. You give one thing to Trump administration, they ask for the next thing the next day. So I don't think it's a sustainable path, and Europeans know as much. So they know it's not ultimately going to get the Europeans where they want, and they will dilute their own digital regulatory agenda, which will tear the Europeans apart. Already now, the European Parliament is up in arms that the Commission is not forceful enough in responding to Elon Musk's attempt to meddle with the internal politics in places like Germany, and that's not sustainable. So the Commission cannot afford to upset the Parliament more. That would be the kind of divide and conquer of the European institutions that the Trump could try to do, but I think the Europeans need to make sure that they don't get to that path. The second, these are binding laws. It's not just the discretion of the Commission on whether to enforce them. They are ultimately subject to the litigation in the European Court of Justice. And if we see what has happened in the privacy space, the privacy activist Max Schrems that has repeatedly taken these companies and the European enforcers to the court if they don't enforce the regulatory agenda. These cases make their way to the European Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice is not bargaining with the Trump administration. They are not looking at whether and how to enforce these laws and whether we would make a deal on aid to Ukraine or how this impacts tariffs. These are binding laws, and the Europeans need to continue to depoliticize, explain that their hands are tied, and they have to enforce them. So in that sense, I think that I am not as worried about the Europeans seeing that there's a path available to start bargaining on these issues. What the Europeans have to do, though, and this is important, is to try to continue to work with other like-minded allies. The Australians are pretty strict with their regulations. I think they need to continue to try to work with the UK. There's still a lot of support for the UK, even though, Max, I share with you my concern of this attempt by the Labour government now to double down on this narrative of growth and innovation and try to portray that the commitment to regulation is antithetical to that agenda. But you work with the Koreans, you work with the Japanese, you work with the rest of the world. Look at Brazilians. There was a big standoff between the Brazilian judge and Elon Musk, and who backed down? It wasn't Brazilians, it was Elon Musk. So there are many markets around the world where the Europeans need to continue to work with and say, look, we have also an alliance of committed enforcers that want to hold the tech companies accountable. That reduces the bargaining power that the tech companies have. I think your example of Apple threatening to withhold products from Europe was illustrative. They are going to try to use that tactic before. But where do these companies go? They can't afford to abandon Europe. They cannot go to China, and they don't have a free rein in markets like Brazil and Australia. And as long as these companies' revenue is tied to advertising, the advertising revenue per user is much higher in markets like Europe compared to India or other parts of the world. So you need to pick up a lot of users in the developing world if you feel that you walk away from Europe. So the Europeans need to understand they are not weak. They still have their market power. They have binding laws and mandates to enforce them. So I think that's what I would keep telling the Europeans, and that's what ultimately I expect the Europeans to see.
Thank you, Anu. I think Tom is going to take over to lead us into the discussion.
Yeah.
Tom.
Thank you for a pair of very rich and thought-provoking presentations that instill a bit more optimism in what feels a very bleak moment. So I'm truly grateful for that. But thanks too for just prompting thinking in dimensions that I don't think we've always traveled within this working group. So it's really helpful, and I think we'll lift up a number of those questions as we go into the conversation. So let me first encourage anyone who would like to turn on their cameras rather, and to join this conversation, to put up hands as you have questions. And let me first just jump into things by calling in my colleague, Paige Arthur. Paige, will you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, I'm Paige Arthur. I'm the Director of Global Programs here at Columbia Global. I recently published a book called AI for Peace, and have worked quite a bit in the past on kind of convening around the use of data-driven approaches in conflict prevention. A lot of work with governments in the UN, et cetera. I've been here at Columbia Global for a year. Anu, I'm such a huge fan of your work. Thank you so much for this presentation. And I agree with Tom, it kind of comes at a bleak time. And so I wanted to take advantage of this opportunity of having you and your expertise to dig a little bit deeper on kind of what you were just talking about. And I have to say that I think I personally have been surprised by the way that the tech industry and tech leadership has signaled here in the United States. It's kind of a seeming alliance with Trump, the very strong libertarian bent that seems to have been taken in the first couple of days of this administration with the pardoning of the operator of the Silk Road website. We can see clearly the total abandonment of principles of self-regulation that entities like Meta and obviously X several years ago, that they've abandoned this. And I agree completely with you that obviously the Europeans should be working with the like-minded countries, trying to form, strengthen their kind of principled approach to this, rely on the law that they have off the books, and they're the pioneers in that. But I just wonder if there's a fundamental shift occurring underneath our feet, and we're not really seeing yet what the repercussions of that are going to be. And I just say that because I personally have been like a bit stunned by what we've been seeing and what the media has been reporting on here in the United States. So I wanted to just get your perspective on that, and also the perspective of others on this call. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Paige. Tom, is it okay that I answer? Do you want to collect a few questions? Yes. So I share your concern that something rather fundamental is shifting. We see the boldness that we didn't see before. And it just shows that these companies don't really have principles and values. They shift where the politics are and what they can get away with. So everything that they were projecting in terms of their commitment to ethics and self-regulation, now they feel like they no longer need to be burdened by those. So that wasn't their ethos. That wasn't who they are and how they wanted to portray themselves to the world. But I think there are a couple of issues. So I think even in the United States, the question, and I'm interested in how much the states are pushing back. Is California going to continue to be vigilant on issues like AI regulation? And even there are some voices inside the Trump administration that I think we are gearing up right now. In Inauguration Day, everything looks like the agenda is set and there are a few constraints. But there are internal battles. J.D. Vance is not a fan of tech companies. He's spoken very favorably of Lina Khan. Elon Musk supported the AI regulation on existential risks in California. So there are still sort of pockets where I feel that we might see the US not fully embrace the libertarian agenda. I agree that the free speech rhetoric is now really on steroids. That's where the free speech fundamentalists like Elon Musk are probably not going to turn or moderate their stance. But I think there may be other areas of the tech where we see something. You see how if something is certain about Trump is his unpredictability. What happened with TikTok? At first he was banning TikTok. Now he wants to save TikTok. It was under him that some of these cases, antitrust cases against Google started. He doesn't love these tech companies. He thinks Facebook is evil. And I am sure these companies will do something to upset him at some point, and he's prepared to turn on them. So I think in many ways, there's still unpredictability also where the US is going to be. And this is really, it hurts me to say, but if you have these companies scale back on regulation, self-regulation, bad things will happen. And that will upset the public. We see more scandals on reckless use of AI, of infringement of privacy, and that turns the public again more forcefully against these companies. So it's not that the entire United States, the users, the employees of these companies, the states are 100% lined up behind the anti-regulatory agenda. And I think I take some hope that the Europeans, the coalition, and some internal forces in the US also push back. I hope it doesn't come through a massive, costly societal catastrophe that we need to experience to be alerted and reminded that left to their own devices, we are not safe with the tech companies, but that's also one potential path forward. But they feel, I think, they're strongest right now. And the question is when the reality kicks in, how strongly will the internal forces inside companies, inside the states, outside of the US push back?
Fabulous. Max, do you want to reflect on what you see as pathways for pushing back against the emerging narrative, against regulation?
Well, I think, the arguments that Anu's made are key. I think just challenging that kind of simplistic regulation versus innovation dichotomy and kind of making the argument that regulation can steer innovation in a better direction. I mean, also just a couple of thoughts on kind of where things go from here and looking at the US. I agree that there are some interesting kind of tensions that are already emerging between, I guess you could say, the kind of tech oligarchs and the more MAGA populist wing. I mean, the kind of fight over visas was one of them, but I think certainly those may kind of continue to expand over the next few years. I think antitrust is certainly an area where there's a lot of unpredictability. Like if you look at the appointments that have been made to FTC and DOJ, Andrew Ferguson, Gail Slater, they certainly don't signal a return to the kind of pre-Lena Khan, Jonathan Cantor side, especially on the tech side. And as Anu mentioned, some of the antitrust cases against the big tech companies in the US started under the first Trump administration. So I think the question is, to what extent will that outweigh the very clear overtures that the big tech companies are making to Trump by changing their content moderation policies, donating to his inaugural fund? And it's very hard to say. Trump is clearly quite a transactional guy. So I guess, does he say, all right, you guys are on my side now, so I'll kind of get the antitrust people to quiet down? Or so I think that's an open question. And then I think the other interesting dynamic to watch will be how that affects the US approach to European efforts to rein in big tech, because Trump has been quite clear. He said this before the election, that he would defend American companies from European regulators. He said that, I think, following a conversation with Tim Cook about state aid, and we've had JD Vance saying, that the US might pull out of NATO if the EU regulates X, and various comments like this. So I think you could potentially see quite a kind of incoherent situation where, on the one hand, the US government is potentially still pursuing some of these actions against big tech domestically, but then they're also going after Europeans and attacking them for being protectionist and so on. So it doesn't necessarily answer the question, but I think those are, again, some of the kind of tensions that we'll see.
That's fabulous. Let's collect a few thoughts at once now. Danny, then Alexandra, then Elena.
Thank you to both of you for making an elaborate point about regulation to support democracy not being a trade-off necessarily with digital innovation. Anu, I particularly can confirm your point about, you didn't use the term brain drain, but your point about a moment in time where Europe has an opportunity to also attract a lot of people who would usually be attracted by the United States. And we also see a lot of Americans actually talking about the Hertie School. I'm the director for this of the Center for Digital Governance at the Hertie School, and what we see in terms of applications of students, but also professors to the Hertie School, there we definitely see an increase of American trained or even American talent to us at least. So at least from my limited experience, I can definitely confirm your point here. If you may allow me to just add one more perspective to this discussion, I'm also wondering whether we can also rethink the way digital innovation is measured. And I was particularly thinking about a paper that was written by Helene Malikova, who's also here. Maybe she will even in just a moment talk about her paper. I would really appreciate that, where she and my colleague Joanna Bryson, who unfortunately cannot make it today, but they looked into alternative measures, especially if I remember correctly, AI patents and also market capitalization of companies in the area of AI to look at digital innovation. And they found that the Europeans, depending on how you measure digital innovation, actually Europeans are not necessarily behind the US. But I leave it to Helene, who also has raised her point, to make this point more elaborate. So I just want to raise this and throw this into the discussion. I'll also copy the link into the chat for anybody who's interested. Thanks.
Thanks, Danny. Alexandra.
Thank you very much for this discussion, and thanks, Anu, again for this fascinating paper, which is true. I mean, but the problem I would say is that the four levers that you mentioned are much more complicated to change than regulation. But that's clearly what we should do now. I wanted to come back at some point that we were discussing too, is on this alliance between the big tech and Trump. In a way, maybe it's not that surprising, because both of them at least share two things. For both of them are disruptor. In a way, Trump was a disruptor in politics as much as tech have been a disruptor in many sectors. And both are to some extent libertarian. So I'm not sure that this alliance is just transactional. I mean, I think it's also, they share some value, and that worries me a bit more than if it was just transactional. The second thing is, what I think all of that shows us is that the value that the DSA, the DMA, and the EU rulebook more generally carry are not shared by everyone, in the US, but also in EU, And so I think what worries me a lot, and I think that was maybe underestimated when the EU digital rulebook was passed, is that those values are not shared by everyone, and there is a battle on those values, which you cannot win just with law. I mean, you have to win that on a political debate, and I think that maybe has been underestimated by a sort of European elite that maybe don't see that much, and I myself have underestimated that completely. So I think that is something which is important. On what Anu said about how to react to all of this, I agree, politicization will be the worst way to go. But I fear that this is what the Commission internally is trying to do. I mean, it is clear now that the decision regarding DSA and DMA are taken by the President of the Commission, So there is a politicization within the House, which worries me. So maybe we will see how it will change in the future. But I think we have to push back, because this is what already I see happening in Brussels. And then the last thing on what Europe can do. I mean, we have a lot of strengths, but I think our two main weakness in that context is dependency and division, And unless we deal with this dependency with others, and in particular with the US on many issues, and division among us, I'm not sure that we can change and we can act on the four levers that Anu was mentioning. But thanks a lot for this discussion anyway.
Thank you so much. And Elena.
Hello, thank you. Indeed, I wanted to just come back on the analysis of the shortcomings of the EU and why EU is bad at innovation. I wanted to just challenge Anu with something like you are making a list of everything that made Silicon Valley succeed, and then you suggest we should do the same. Or where do I read your recipe wrong? Because when we are talking about non-compete clauses, it's classical, basically discussion about what's the success of Silicon Valley. We're talking about, I appreciate the level, the layer of the kind of digital single market. But I think, for example, when I speak with startups, they always complain about not having a single VAT regime, which is much more basic. And we never address this. So I just wonder if you think that there is something that where we should adjust the playbook of Silicon Valley to Europe. And indeed, coming back to thank you so much, Danny, for sharing, not only mentioning, but also sharing the article that we put together with Joanna Bryson about innovation in Europe taking place more, for example, when it comes to digital in the B2B space. And that's something that I think is rarely discussed. It's not, we kind of look with envy to Silicon Valley, but is imitation of something that worked there really a good idea? And I see also this direction in the Draghi report. So what do you think in this respect of the Draghi report? On the question of the Commission, I should have introduced myself first. So I'm Helena Malikova. I work for the European Commission and very much speaking in personal capacity. Here, I'm also affiliated with the digital Centre at Hertie. Basically, I will bring this to something very technical, like a bit of a jargon in antitrust, which is when we are analyzing a possible theory of harm in vertical relationships, we analyze the ability and the incentives to do something. And I think right now, when it comes to the European Commission, if I'm analyzing it from the outside, it's very, very theoretical. I think we're not sure, I'm not sure we have the ability to enforce against the US, given the situation in Ukraine and such. But if we don't even have the incentives, we'll never find out if we have the ability. And that's kind of the way I'm seeing it right now. I appreciate that you have some trust in the checks and balances in the parliament, and I hope you're right on this. I think indeed litigation will be something with Max Schrem's cases, and that it will be also happening big time to resist in Europe. I already know from activists at ACLU, there's a lot of basically mobilization. So that for sure will be one avenue, but it takes time. And yes, so I think we'll have to take these decisions about how to enforce or not, in particular the DSA, way before these checks and balances will be able to kick in. Thank you.
Many thanks to you all. So we have 3 sets of comments and questions, and I'll capture just a slice of each of them. Hopefully you each were tracking the broader set of questions that were put on the table. So Danny is asking about rethinking how digital innovation is measured. In fact, Alexandra Destriel is asking is acknowledging, Anu, that your observation that many of the levers that need to be pulled go far outside the realm of regulation, including immigration policy reform. And so I personally would also love to hear about what pathways you think are actually plausible ones that might be adopted. And Elena asked, among other things, how do we replicate the steps that allowed the US tech industry to thrive? And is that the right pathway for EU companies and regulators to adopt?
Very good, terrific set of questions and observations. So I think we need, as I'm calling for more robust conversation, more nuanced conversation on digital regulation, we need that for innovation. And Max already invited that conversation. So what kind of innovation is worth pursuing? And Europe doesn't actually have a problem with innovation. We have a problem in commercializing our innovations. So in many ways, we have, like if we take quantum computing, we have or nuclear fusion, we have the highest number of experts in this field. We have a lot of knowledge in these domains. What we don't do as well is investing in those. So in quantum computing, the 10 leading investors the companies investing in them are all in the US and China, even though we are number 1 in having the experts. We can innovate, but we are not funding and we are not commercializing those innovations. The same thing if you think about nuclear fusion in terms of the proportion, the sort of adjusted to population, we have the greatest number of experts. And in terms of absolute number, if you look at companies that have raised over 500 million in this space, 4 from the US, 1 from China, none from the EU. So I think there are certain, this ties me a little bit to Helena's question, I think there's much to replicate from the US, and there's also much that we should not replicate. So we should not try to build a European Google. If we are uncomfortable with the surveillance capitalist models, we should not be striving to have a European Facebook. We let China lead in invasive mass surveillance, facial recognition. We're not trying to outdo China there. So we need to ask, what is kind of European innovation that is consistent with our values and that does enhance our wealth and safety and our prosperity? So that is certainly a conversation that should be at the heart and center. So I think we can replicate what is good about the US. I think there are ways how we would think about allowing pension funds to invest in venture firms through venture firms in a way that many countries still prevent them. I think there's low-hanging fruit in the digital single market. That's at the core of the Europeans are already empowered to do. Immigration is a much harder question. Cultural attitudes towards risk-taking is a much harder change to try to initiate. But I don't think we've done as much as we can within the powers that we already have to replicate the parts of the successful European recipe, the American recipe, as you call it, Helena, while being very mindful that some of those are just too hard for the Europeans to change, and others may not be desirable for Europe. But the way we could use our universities as a better channels for foreign talent to come into Europe, I think there's much that the Americans have done right. And if the Americans are now turning they back to that very strength. One of the greatest things about teaching in a place like Columbia is the absolute access to having the most diverse and very international best students from all around the world who come to us. And if the Americans are willing to abandon that great strength, the Europeans should absolutely replicate that same recipe in the European Union. But anyway, there was a rich set of comments, all of which would probably merit a long conversation on their own. But I am broadly in agreement with the more nuanced conversation on innovation and the intricate ways of how we can replicate the success of the US.
Max.
So I would add 2 reflections just based on the discussion I've been hearing. I think one is, I think we need to move beyond what I would call the incrementalist approach that we've seen in the EU to enforcing digital regulation and competition law, of kind of going for the smallest, least invasive remedy first, seeing if that works, waiting a couple of years, then trying the next kind of listen. I think the threat is so serious right now that I think everything needs to be on the table right now. And I think that potentially includes banning platforms, and there are powers to do that under the DSA in extreme circumstances. I think we should also look seriously at structural remedies, if that's a means of kind of addressing the dominance of these companies. Anu mentioned the Brazilian case, and I think really the only reason why X ultimately backed down is because the Brazilian government was kind of really willing to put their money where their mouth was and shut them out of the market. And so I think we need to be similarly bold in Europe, while of course I think doing things in a kind of legally rigorous way and not just politicizing everything. And then I think secondly, and this has already been said, but I think regulation is not the problem, but it's also not the answer to creating a competitive European tech sector. So we need to look at all the different things that Anu was talking about, which I think are really important. I also, something that wasn't mentioned, but I also think we lack a kind of really European level private capital market, but we also lack really common European public fiscal capacity. Industrial policy still mostly happens at the national level. There are attempts to kind of do things through state aid, but it's a very imperfect way of kind of investing publicly at the European level. So I think we need much more resources to be going into helping build alternatives in cloud computing, for example, in chips and all these kinds of areas, which isn't happening right now. And again, that's an advantage the US has as well. If you look at historically what they've done with DARPA, but more recently with the CHIPS Act, the government is much more able to kind of send a signal to private investors using their own resources. So I think we need to try and build that in Europe.
This is great. We are at the end of our time, so maybe I'll actually allow those to be our final statements from you each.